Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing at the edge of an endless forest in late autumn, 1795. The air carries that particular sharpness that warns of approaching cold. Behind you lies everything familiar, the settled coastal regions where your family has lived for generations, where taverns glow with warm firelight and church bells mark the passing hours. Before you stretches an wilderness so vast it seems to swallow the horizon itself, a landscape of ancient trees, frozen rivers, and wind that speaks in voices you've never heard before. Before we begin, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? You're about to become a pioneer, though you don't yet fully understand what that word will cost you. You've heard the stories, of course, tales of abundant land waiting for those brave enough to claim it, promises of freedom and prosperity that shimmer like mirages in your imagination. What you haven't fully grasped is how winter in these frontier territories will test every assumption you hold about survival, about family, about what human beings can endure when nature strips away all pretense of civilization. The period between 1780 and 1860 witnessed one of the greatest migrations in human history, as hundreds of thousands of settlers pushed westward from the Atlantic seaboard into territories that would eventually become the American heartland. These weren't professional explorers or military expeditions, but ordinary families, farmers and craftsmen, mothers and children, elderly grandparents and newborn infants, all venturing into landscapes where a single mistake could mean death, where winter arrived not as inconvenience but as existential threat. Understanding how these pioneers survived requires us to look beyond the romantic myths that later generations would construct about frontier life. We need to see the reality, the desperate improvisations, the accumulated wisdom borrowed from indigenous peoples, the community bonds that meant the difference between survival and catastrophe, the psychological resilience that allowed human beings to maintain hope when every rational calculation suggested surrender. The story begins not with the journey itself, but with the decision to leave. In the years following the American Revolution, the new nation found itself with vast territories stretching westward from the Appalachian Mountains. The British had ceded enormous lands through the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and the young American government was eager to see these territories settled, both to establish sovereignty and to generate revenue through land sales. For families living in the crowded coastal regions, the frontier represented possibility. Land in established areas had become expensive and scarce, divided and subdivided through generations until farms were too small to support growing families. The frontier promised something different, the chance to own substantial property, to build wealth that could be passed to children, to escape the rigid social hierarchies that governed life in longer settled regions. But the decision to migrate was never simple or easy. Families debated for months, sometimes years, weighing opportunity against risk. They listened to reports from earlier migrants, trying to separate truth from exaggeration in accounts of both hardship and abundance. They calculated costs, the price of transportation, the expense of tools and supplies, the loss of established businesses or trades they would abandon. Women often resisted migration more than men, understanding perhaps more clearly what frontier life would demand of them. Leaving meant abandoning support networks of mothers, sisters, and female friends who helped with childbirth, illness, and the daily work of household management. It meant accepting isolation that could be psychologically devastating, especially during winter months when travel became impossible and families might go weeks without seeing another human being outside their immediate household. Children's perspectives varied by age. Older children often shared their mother's reluctance, understanding what they would lose in terms of schooling, friendship, and familiar routines. Younger children sometimes viewed the prospect as adventure, not yet fully grasping the realities that awaited them. The elderly faced particularly difficult choices, knowing they might be undertaking their final journey, that graves in frontier territories would be far from ancestral burial grounds. Yet despite all these concerns, families made the decision to go. Some were pushed by economic desperation, unable to support themselves in established regions where opportunities had contracted. Others were pulled by genuine opportunity, attracted by government land policies that offered property at prices far below Eastern rates. Still others sought escape from various constraints, religious minorities hoping to practice their faith freely, younger sons who would inherit nothing under primogeniture laws, families fleeing debts or failed businesses. The timing of migration was crucial, and miscalculation could prove fatal. The ideal pattern was to depart in early spring, travel during summer months, arrive at the destination by late summer or early autumn, and use the remaining warm weather to establish basic shelter and stockpile supplies before winter's arrival. Families who departed too late or encountered unexpected delays often found themselves attempting to survive winter without adequate preparation, a situation that frequently ended in tragedy. The journey itself deserves attention because it shaped what resources families would have available for their first winter. Every decision about what to bring and what to leave behind carried consequences that would become apparent only months later, when winter made replacement or resupply impossible. Wagons had to be carefully loaded to balance immediate needs during travel against future requirements for winter survival. Food sufficient for the journey, typically several months, had to be carried along with seeds for spring planting, tools for construction and agriculture, clothing appropriate for all seasons, household goods essential for daily living, and sometimes livestock that would provide food, labour, and breeding stock. The weight limitations were severe. A typical wagon pulled by oxen or horses could carry perhaps 2,000 pounds, a constraint that forced agonizing choices about what to include. Families brought iron cookware rather than delicate china, serviceable wool clothing rather than fine fabrics, essential tools rather than decorative furniture. Books, if brought at all, were usually limited to a Bible and perhaps one or two other volumes considered indispensable. These choices reflected not just practical calculations but also psychological needs. Women often insisted on bringing certain items, a particular quilt made by a grandmother, a set of dishes that connected to family history, objects that would help maintain cultural continuity and emotional stability in the wilderness. Men focused on tools and weapons, understanding that their ability to provide shelter, food, and protection would determine their family's survival. The journey westward was itself an education in frontier survival. Families learned to read weather from cloud patterns and animal behavior. They practiced setting up and breaking camp with increasing efficiency. They developed systems for managing food supplies, water procurement, and waste disposal. They learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to treat common ailments with available materials, how to repair equipment with limited resources. They also learned about community cooperation among the migrant families travelling together in wagon trains. These temporary communities developed informal but effective systems of mutual aid. Families shared knowledge, tools, and sometimes food. They helped each other with difficult tasks like crossing rivers or navigating particularly challenging terrain. They provided emotional support during illness, injury, or death. The relationships formed during these journeys sometimes persisted after families reached their destinations and settled in proximity to one another. The bonds created through shared hardship provided foundations for the community networks that would prove essential for surviving frontier winters. People who had helped each other cross the Appalachians or ford the Ohio River were more likely to continue that cooperation when facing winter's challenges together. Arrival at the destination typically occurred in late summer or early autumn, providing a narrow window of perhaps 8 to 12 weeks before winter would make outdoor work impossible. This period was perhaps the most crucial of the entire pioneering experience. The quality of preparation accomplished during these weeks would largely determine whether a family survived their first winter. The first priority was always shelter. A family arriving in September might have until late November or early December before temperatures would drop low enough to make unprotected exposure life-threatening. This meant perhaps 10 weeks to construct housing that would protect against cold that could easily reach 20 or 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit in northern territories. The type of shelter varied based on available materials and the family's skills and resources. In heavily forested regions, log cabins represented the standard solution. These structures required significant labor, but used materials readily available without cost. A family with adult male labor, and perhaps assistance from neighbors, could construct a basic cabin in 3 to 4 weeks of intensive work. The process began with selecting appropriate trees, usually straight specimens of consistent diameter, typically 12 to 16 inches thick. Pine, oak, or other locally abundant species were used based on what grew in the area. Trees were felled using axes, one of the most essential tools any pioneer family carried. The logs were then trimmed of branches and cut to appropriate lengths, usually determining the cabin's dimensions. A typical first cabin might measure only 14 by 16 feet, providing about 224 square feet of interior space for an entire family. This cramped dimension reflected not laziness, but practical necessity. Larger structures required more time to build, more materials to construct, and more fuel to heat through the winter. Families planned to build larger, more comfortable housing later, but the first winter demanded basic protection accomplished quickly. The logs were notched at the ends to allow them to interlock at the cabin's corners. Various notching techniques existed, each with advantages and disadvantages. The saddle notch was common because it was relatively easy to execute without specialized tools, while the dovetail notch provided superior strength, but required more skill and time to create properly. As walls rose through the stacking of successive logs, gaps between them had to be filled to prevent wind and cold from penetrating. This chinking process used whatever materials were available, typically a mixture of clay, mud, moss, and grass. The mixture had to be carefully formulated to remain flexible enough not to crack as the wood expanded and contracted with temperature and humidity changes, yet firm enough to provide effective insulation. The roof presented particular challenges. The simplest approach was a single-slope shed roof, which required less time and materials than a peaked gable roof, but provided less interior height and was more vulnerable to snow accumulation. Many pioneers compromised with a gable roof of modest pitch, steep enough to shed most snow, but not so steep as to require excessive labour or materials. Roofing materials varied by region and resources. Split wooden shingles provided excellent protection, but required time and skill to produce. Bark, particularly from birch trees, could be layered to create effective waterproofing. Thatch made from prairie grasses worked in plains regions where timber was scarce. Each solution represented a trade-off between effectiveness, resource availability, and time required for installation. The floor of the first cabin was often nothing more than packed earth. Wooden floors required additional labour, materials, and time that many families couldn't afford during their crucial first autumn. The earth floor was gradually hardened through use and could be relatively comfortable if kept dry, though it contributed to dampness and cold rising from the ground. Chimneys and fireplaces demanded particular attention because this would be essential for both heating and cooking throughout the winter. Stone chimneys were ideal, but required significant labour and, in some regions, were impossible due to lack of appropriate stone. Many pioneers built wooden chimneys lined with clay, a solution that worked adequately if maintained carefully, but carried significant fire risk. The fireplace opening had to be carefully sized. Too small, and it wouldn't provide adequate heat or cooking space. Too large, and it would draw too much air, creating uncomfortable drafts while consuming fuel at an unsustainable rate. Experienced builders knew the proportions that balanced these concerns, but many first-time cabin builders learned through trial and error, sometimes literally freezing until they could make adjustments. Windows presented a dilemma. They provided light and ventilation, but also represented breaks in the cabin's thermal envelope. Glass was expensive and fragile, often impossible to obtain in frontier regions. Many pioneers initially left windows as simple openings that could be covered with wooden shutters, animal skins stretched thin enough to transmit some light, or oiled paper that provided minimal transparency while blocking wind. Doors had to be substantial enough to keep out cold and wind while remaining functional, despite temperature extremes that caused wood to swell and shrink dramatically. Leather hinges often worked better than metal ones, which were expensive and could become brittle in extreme cold. A simple wooden latch that could be operated from inside while allowing the door to be barred securely was standard. While the cabin was being constructed, usually by the men and older boys, the women and girls worked on equally essential preparations. Food preservation consumed enormous amounts of time and labour during those crucial autumn weeks. Whatever food the family would eat between December and April had to be procured, processed, and stored during this narrow window. Hunting became a daily priority. Deer provided not only meat, but also hides for clothing and leather. A single deer might yield 60 to 80 pounds of meat, but that would feed a family of 6 for only about 2 weeks. Families needed to preserve meat from multiple animals to survive winter. Smoking was the most common preservation method, requiring the construction of a smokehouse or designated area where meat could be hung and exposed to smoke from smouldering hardwood for days or weeks. The smoking process required constant attention. The fire had to be carefully maintained to produce smoke without excessive heat, which would cook the meat rather than cure it. Different woods imparted different flavours and had different preservative properties. Hickory was prized where available, but maple, oak or fruit woods also worked well. The meat had to be monitored for signs of spoilage, and rotated to ensure even smoke exposure. Salt, when available, provided another preservation method. Salt pork packed in barrels could keep for months if prepared properly. But salt was expensive in frontier regions, often costing more than the meat itself. Families used it sparingly, salting only the most valuable cuts, while relying on smoking for the bulk of their meat preservation. Wild game wasn't the only protein source. Families brought livestock when possible, chickens for eggs, a cow or goat for milk, pigs that could forage in forests and be slaughtered for winter meat. But maintaining livestock through winter required stored feed, another burden on the family's preparation time. Hay had to be cut, dried, and stored in quantities sufficient to feed animals for 5 or 6 months. Plant foods required different preservation approaches. Root vegetables like potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions could be stored in underground pits lined with straw and covered with soil to prevent freezing while maintaining the humidity needed to prevent shriveling. The pit had to be carefully located and constructed. Too shallow and the vegetables would freeze, too deep or too damp and they would rot. Dried vegetables and fruits represented another preservation strategy. Beans and peas could be dried in their pods or shelled, then stored in cloth bags or barrels. Apples, when available, were sliced thin and dried in the sun or near the fire. Dried foods took up less storage space and were lighter, important considerations given the limited capacity of frontier cabins. Corn was perhaps the most valuable crop for pioneer families. It could be eaten fresh during autumn, dried and ground into cornmeal that would keep for months, or processed into hominy through treatment with wood ash lye. Cornmeal became the staple grain for most frontier families because wheat was difficult to grow and process without specialized equipment. Women spent long hours during autumn grinding corn using hand mills or primitive mortars and pestles, converting whole kernels into meal fine enough for baking. The work was physically exhausting and time-consuming but essential. Cornmeal made into cornbread, mush, or johnny cakes would provide the bulk of calories for many frontier families through winter months. Preserves and pickles, when sugar and vinegar were available, provided both nutrition and psychological comfort during winter's monotony. Wild berries gathered during summer could be cooked with precious sugar into jams and jellies. Cucumbers, if planted early enough, could be pickled in vinegar with salt and spices. These preserved foods helped prevent scurvy while providing variety to otherwise monotonous diets. Medicinal plants had to be gathered and prepared during autumn before frost killed them. Women with knowledge of herbal medicine collected roots, leaves, and seeds from plants known to treat common ailments. Willow bark for fever and pain, golden seal for infections, slippery elm for coughs and digestive problems, chamomile for anxiety and sleep problems. These remedies would be essential during winter when illness was common and professional medical help was impossible to obtain. Fuel for heating and cooking represented perhaps the most critical preparation of all. A pioneer family might need 10 to 15 cords of firewood to survive a severe winter, where a cord represented a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long. Cutting, splitting, and stacking this much wood required weeks of hard physical labor. The wood had to be properly seasoned, meaning dried sufficiently to burn efficiently. Green wood contained too much moisture and would produce more smoke than heat, while consuming oxygen needed to maintain a strong fire. Ideally, wood should be cut in spring and allowed to dry through summer, but families arriving in autumn had to work with what was available, often burning less than ideal fuel because they had no alternative. Different woods had different burning characteristics. Hardwoods like oak, hickory, and maple burned hotter and longer than softwoods like pine or cedar. But hardwoods were also harder to split and slower to season. Softwoods ignited easily and were useful for starting fires, but burned quickly and produced more creosote that could accumulate in chimneys and create fire hazards. The woodpile's location mattered tremendously. It had to be close enough to the cabin for convenient access during blizzards when visibility dropped to zero, but not so close that it created fire hazards. It had to be protected from snow accumulation that would make wood retrieval difficult, but not enclosed in ways that prevented air circulation needed for continued drying. Families learned to read their woodpile's adequacy by various indicators. Experienced frontiersmen claimed you knew you had enough wood when you thought you'd prepared twice what you could possibly need. This seemingly excessive standard reflected hard-earned wisdom about how quickly fuel could be consumed during extended periods of severe cold. Water access had to be secured before winter froze streams and wells. Some families were fortunate enough to locate near springs that flowed year-round. Others depended on streams that would freeze over, requiring daily labour to chop through ice that grew thicker as winter progressed. Wells provided more reliable access, but required significant time to dig, and not all families could complete well construction before winter arrived. Families learned to keep barrels of water inside the cabin where it wouldn't freeze, creating an emergency supply that could sustain them if conditions made outdoor water retrieval temporarily impossible. Melting snow for water was possible but inefficient, requiring enormous amounts of snow to produce relatively small amounts of water while consuming precious fuel. Clothing preparation occupied much of women's time during autumn. Wool was the most valuable fabric for winter survival, retaining warmth even when damp. Families brought sheep when possible, shearing them in spring, washing and carding the wool, spinning it into yarn, and weaving or knitting it into fabric or garments. This process required specialized skills and equipment that not all frontier families possessed. Trade with other families or with the few merchants operating in frontier regions allowed some exchange of goods and services. A family with surplus grain might trade for wool cloth. A skilled seamstress might make clothing for neighbors in exchange for preserved food. These economic relationships built community bonds while allowing families to acquire goods they couldn't produce themselves. Leather was equally important, providing material for boots, gloves, and outer garments that protected against wind and wet conditions. Processing hides into usable leather required knowledge and time. The hide had to be cleaned of all tissue, treated to prevent decomposition, and softened through mechanical working or chemical treatment. The brain tanning method used by many indigenous peoples produced soft, durable leather, but required expertise that not all pioneers possessed. Footwear deserved special attention because frozen feet could easily lead to gangrene and death. Boots had to be well constructed with multiple layers for insulation and waterproofing. Many pioneers stuffed their boots with dry grass or fur scraps for additional warmth. They learned to carry spare footwear and repair materials because replacing damaged boots during winter was often impossible. The psychological preparation for winter isolation was perhaps the most overlooked but equally essential aspect of frontier survival. Families needed to prepare not just physically but emotionally for months of confinement in close quarters with limited activities and constant cold. women with small children faced particular challenges. Toddlers who had played freely outdoors all summer would be confined to a single room for months. Their energy and noise in such cramped conditions could test anyone's patience. Mothers needed strategies for keeping children occupied. Simple toys made from scraps of wood or fabric, singing games and stories that required no materials, basic lessons in letters and numbers that provided structure to long days. Older children faced boredom that could breed conflict among siblings forced into constant proximity. Families developed routines that gave everyone defined responsibilities and activities. Boys might help maintain the fire, bring in firewood from outside storage, tend any livestock sheltered near the cabin. Girls assisted with cooking, sewing, and childcare. These routines provided structure that helped prevent the psychological deterioration that could occur during prolonged isolation. Reading materials, when available, provided crucial mental stimulation. The Bible was almost universal, serving both spiritual and practical purposes as one of the few texts most families owned. Some families carried almanacs, which provided not only calendars and weather predictions, but also essays, stories, and practical advice on various topics. A few precious books might be read and reread countless times through winter months. Music provided emotional relief from winter's monotony. Families sang together around the evening fire, hymns and folk songs that connected them to cultural traditions while creating moments of beauty and joy amid hardship. Some families brought fiddles or other instruments, though these were luxuries that many couldn't accommodate given weight restrictions during travel. Storytelling became an art form during winter evenings. Parents and grandparents recounted family histories, tales from the old country or previous generations, moral fables that taught lessons while entertaining. Children learned their cultural heritage through these stories, while also developing narrative skills they would pass to their own children. The relationships between family members took on heightened importance during winter confinement. Couples had to navigate disagreements in spaces where privacy was impossible. Parents had to discipline children while maintaining authority without resorting to harshness that would make small spaces unbearable for everyone. Siblings had to learn tolerance and cooperation because escape from conflict was impossible. Extended families living in single cabins faced particular challenges in negotiating relationships between adults. Married sons or daughters with their spouses and children, aging parents requiring care, unmarried adult siblings all crowding into spaces of a few hundred square feet, required patience, compromise, and clear understandings about authority and responsibility. As October yielded to November, families watched weather patterns with increasing anxiety, hoping they'd completed adequate preparations before winter's arrival. The first snow often came as a light dusting that melted within days, a warning of what was coming. Temperature began to drop noticeably, especially at night. Mornings revealed frost on vegetation and thin ice at the edges of streams and ponds. Animals behaved differently as winter approached. Deer moved to sheltered areas with better food sources. Birds migrated in great flocks that darkened the sky. Squirrels worked frantically to complete their winter caches. Experienced frontiersmen read these signs carefully, understanding that nature's preparations reflected coming conditions that humans also needed to anticipate. The transition from autumn to winter varied dramatically by location. In the northernmost territories of what would become Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, winter could arrive by late October, lasting until April or even May. In the middle regions, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, winter typically began in November and persisted until March. Further south, in Kentucky and Tennessee, winters were shorter but could still be severe, with ice storms and occasional bitter cold. The first serious snowfall transformed the landscape almost overnight. Families often woke to find familiar surroundings rendered unrecognizable by a blanket of white. The psychological impact of this transformation shouldn't be underestimated. The visual evidence that they were now truly isolated, cut off from other humans except for the most desperate emergencies, affected everyone differently. Some people felt a peaceful sense of being sealed away from the outside world's cares and dangers, a kind of hibernation that wasn't unpleasant. Others experienced immediate anxiety about confinement and isolation, worrying about all the things that might go wrong without possibility of outside help. Children's responses varied from excitement about the snow to fear of the strange new world outside their windows. The daily routine of winter life established patterns that would persist for months. The day typically began before dawn, when the fire that had been banked overnight needed to be stirred back to life. This was cold, uncomfortable work. The person assigned to fire duty, usually the husband or an older son, had to leave the relative warmth of the bed and work with freezing hands to arrange kindling and wood in ways that would coax flames from glowing coals. Once the fire was burning well, temperature in the cabin would gradually rise to tolerable levels, though it was never truly warm except immediately adjacent to the fireplace. People dressed quickly in layers of wool, keeping outer garments on even indoors. The concept of heating an entire house to comfortable room temperature was beyond the capacity of frontier heating systems and fuel supplies. Breakfast preparation began as soon as sufficient light made cooking possible. Meals during winter were simpler than summer fare, limited by available ingredients and the need to conserve fuel by minimizing cooking time. Cornmeal mush was a standard breakfast, cooked into a thick porridge that could be eaten hot or allowed to cool and solidify, then sliced and fried for later meals. Salt pork, if available, provided fat and protein. A few thin slices fried in a pan rendered fat that could be used for cooking, while the meat itself added flavor and substance to the meal. Eggs from chickens, if the family had managed to keep birds alive through winter's cold, were precious treats, carefully rationed rather than consumed freely. After breakfast, the day's work began. Men's winter labor focused on maintaining the household's basic functions. Fire maintenance was constant, requiring judgment about when to add fuel to maintain adequate heat without consuming wood too quickly. The fire had to be monitored carefully because letting it go out completely would create a crisis, requiring it to be restarted using precious resources while the family suffered in freezing conditions. Caring for livestock was another daily necessity that couldn't be postponed regardless of weather. Animals sheltered in simple barns or lean-tos near the cabin needed water that hadn't frozen, feed from limited supplies, and monitoring for illness or injury. This work often had to be done in brutal conditions, when wind made exposed skin painful within minutes, and snowfall limited visibility to a few yards. Men also worked on various maintenance and construction projects that could be accomplished indoors. Tool maintenance was essential, sharpening axes and knives that were dull with use, repairing broken handles or cracked blades, making new tools from raw materials when possible. These skills were critical because replacing tools was often impossible until spring, when travel to distant merchants might become feasible again. Women's work was equally constant and demanding. Cooking consumed significant time and attention. 3 meals needed to be prepared daily using limited ingredients and cooking methods. The fireplace had to serve all cooking functions, requiring careful management of different temperature zones for various purposes. Bread needed sustained moderate heat. Meat needed higher temperatures for initial cooking. Stews required long, slow cooking that had to be monitored to prevent burning. Sewing and mending were nearly constant activities. Clothing wore out quickly under frontier conditions and had to be repaired repeatedly before it could be replaced. Women learned to patch garments multiple times, sometimes creating entire new sections from salvaged fabric when original material wore through. Socks were darned so many times they became more darn than original sock, but they still provided essential protection for feet. Making new clothing from raw materials consumed weeks of labor. Spinning wool into thread, weaving thread into fabric, cutting and sewing fabric into garments required skills that took years to master. Many frontier women had learned these skills from their mothers and grandmothers, but others had to develop competence through trial and error, producing crude first attempts that gradually improved with practice. Childcare was woven through all other work. Infants and toddlers needed constant attention and supervision in spaces where open fires and boiling pots created constant dangers. Mothers developed strategies for managing children while accomplishing necessary work, carrying infants in slings that left hands free for cooking, teaching toddlers to play quietly in designated safe areas, assigning older children responsibility for watching younger siblings. Education for children continued through winter as time and energy allowed. Basic literacy and numeracy were highly valued, though not always achievable given the demands of survival. Parents who could read and write themselves often spent evening hours teaching children letters and numbers, using charcoal or precious paper and ink when available, or practicing letter formation in ashes or sand when materials were limited. Religious observance provided structure and meaning to frontier life. Families typically gathered for prayer and Bible reading, often in the evening when work was done and everyone was assembled around the fire. These practices connected them to faith traditions while also providing moments of calm reflection that countered the constant stress of survival challenges. Sundays were observed as days of rest by most families, though the definition of rest was flexible, given that animals still needed care and fires still needed maintenance. But unnecessary work was avoided, creating a rhythm that differentiated one day from another and prevented the psychological blurring that could occur when every day seemed identical. The intensity of winter cold varied considerably both by location and by particular weather systems that swept through territories. Settlers in northern regions regularly experienced temperatures far below 0 Fahrenheit, conditions that were not merely uncomfortable, but genuinely life-threatening. Exposed skin could freeze within minutes. Inadequate clothing could lead to frostbite and potentially death within hours. Blizzards were the most feared weather events. These storms brought not just heavy snow, but high winds that reduced visibility to 0 and created life-threatening conditions even over short distances. Families learned to string ropes between their cabin and essential outbuildings, allowing them to maintain contact with animals and water sources even when visibility made navigation by sight impossible. Stories of people becoming lost and freezing to death within yards of safety were common enough to create deep anxiety about venturing outside during storms. Children were strictly forbidden from going out alone under any circumstances. Adults worked in pairs when possible, ensuring that if one person became disoriented or injured, the other could provide assistance or summon help. The psychological impact of blizzards extended beyond their immediate duration. The howling wind that rattled walls and found every gap in the cabin's construction, the complete whiteout that made the world beyond windows invisible, the sense of being utterly cut off from any outside assistance created stress that affected everyone differently. Some people found blizzards exciting in their dramatic power. Others experienced genuine terror that didn't diminish even as they gained experience with surviving such events. Between storms, winter could be almost peaceful. Clear, cold days with brilliant sunshine reflecting off snow created beauty that even frontier families paused to appreciate. The silence of snow-covered forests, broken only by occasional animal sounds or the crack of freezing ice, provided its own form of meditation for people whose lives were usually filled with constant noise and activity. These clear periods also allowed for essential outdoor work that couldn't be done during storms. Men could hunt for fresh meat, a valuable supplement to preserve supplies. They could check on distant livestock or inspect damage to structures that might need repair. They could cut and haul additional firewood if supplies were running low, though working in extreme cold made such labor exhausting and dangerous. Hunting during winter required different strategies than summer hunting. Game animals had changed their behavior, moving to protected areas and becoming more cautious as food grew scarce. Tracking became easier in snow, but conditions that made tracking possible also made long-distance travel difficult and dangerous. Hunters had to balance the potential reward of fresh meat against the real risk of becoming lost or injured far from help. Ice fishing provided another winter food source where it was possible. Lakes and larger streams froze thick enough to support human weight, allowing people to chop holes through ice and fish in waters below. The catch was typically smaller than summer fishing, but any fresh food was welcome variety from preserved supplies. The darkness of winter affected everyone's mood and energy. In northern latitudes, daylight might last only 8 or 9 hours at winter's depth, leaving long evening and early morning hours of darkness. Families economized on lamp oil and candles, expensive commodities that had to last through winter. So many activities stopped as soon as natural light faded. These long dark hours could foster depression and anxiety, what some modern researchers call seasonal affective disorder. Frontier families didn't have terminology for such conditions, but they recognized that winter affected people's spirits. Some became withdrawn and lethargic, others grew irritable and prone to conflict. Families developed various strategies for maintaining morale through the dark months. Music and storytelling mentioned earlier served partly to combat winter darkness. Singing familiar songs or listening to stories provided emotional connection and mental stimulation that helped counter the isolation and sensory deprivation of winter confinement. Games played by firelight, simple amusements using homemade dice or cards, offered another form of entertainment and family bonding. Maintaining hope was perhaps the most important psychological task of winter survival. Everyone needed to believe that spring would eventually come, that their current hardships were temporary, that they would survive to see warmer weather and renewed abundance. This hope sometimes required active cultivation, particularly during February and March when winter had lasted so long that spring seemed impossible to imagine. Parents worked to maintain optimistic attitudes for their children's sake, even when they felt their own hope flagging. They marked the passing days, noting when the winter solstice passed and days began slowly lengthening again. They watched for any subtle signs of seasonal change, temperature rising slightly above freezing during midday hours, changes in animal behavior suggesting instinctual anticipation of spring, the first bare patches of ground appearing where snow melted in particularly sunny locations. Illness was a constant threat during winter months. Close confinement facilitated the spread of infectious diseases among family members. Respiratory ailments were common, minor colds that could become serious in the absence of warmth and adequate nutrition. Influenza, when it struck, could kill vulnerable individuals, particularly young children, the elderly, or those already weakened by other conditions. The treatment options available to frontier families were extremely limited by modern standards. They relied on folk remedies, herbal preparations, and basic nursing care that focused on keeping patients warm, hydrated, and as comfortable as possible while their bodies fought illness. Sometimes these approaches were successful and people recovered. Other times, despite everyone's best efforts, illness proved fatal. The death of a family member during winter created particular challenges. Burial was often impossible when ground was frozen solid. Bodies might be kept in unheated outbuildings where cold would preserve them until spring thaw made burial possible, or they might be placed in temporary shallow graves to be properly buried later. The grief was complicated by the necessity of continuing daily survival tasks even while mourning. Children who lost siblings or parents during winter had to process their grief in the same confined spaces where they'd lived together, surrounded by constant reminders of the deceased. Parents who lost children experienced anguish made worse by feelings of responsibility, wondering if different decisions might have prevented the death, if they'd failed in their duty to protect their offspring. Yet life continued even amid loss. Survival demanded that the living focus on their own needs and those of remaining family members. Fires had to be maintained, meals prepared, animals tended, all the daily necessities that couldn't be postponed for mourning. This necessity for continuing function provided its own form of therapy, preventing the kind of paralytic grief that might otherwise have overwhelmed bereaved families. Religious faith provided essential comfort for most frontier families during times of loss, belief that deceased loved ones had gone to a better place, that death was not final separation but temporary parting, that God's providence governed all events including tragic ones. These convictions helped people find meaning in experiences that might otherwise have seemed unbearable. Community support, when available, played crucial roles in helping families survive winter crises. Neighbors who learned of illness or death would sometimes brave dangerous conditions to provide assistance, bringing food, medicine, or simply companionship that reminded isolated families they weren't entirely alone. These acts of mutual aid created social bonds that persisted for generations, becoming foundational stories that defined community identity. But truly isolated families faced crises without outside help, making decisions and enduring outcomes entirely on their own. The responsibility and stress of such isolation was immense, particularly for parents who bore ultimate accountability for their family's welfare. Some people grew stronger under this pressure, developing confidence and competence they might never have discovered in more supported circumstances. Others broke under the strain, developing various forms of psychological distress that affected them for years afterward. As February gave way to March, even in the coldest territories, subtle signs of approaching spring became apparent. The sun's arc through the sky climbed noticeably higher. Midday temperatures occasionally rose above freezing, creating brief thaws that melted snow in exposed locations. Icicles dripped during the warmest afternoon hours, creating sounds that winter-weary families found beautiful simply because they suggested seasonal change. Birds that had disappeared or grown silent during deepest winter began to reappear and vocalize. The first returning migrants, sometimes as early as late February in southern territories, brought dramatic evidence that the larger world beyond winter still existed. Robins searching for earthworms in patches of bare ground, red-winged blackbirds whose calls had been absent for months, geese flying northward in great V formations, all announced that nature's annual cycle was progressing toward renewal. These signs lifted spirits dramatically. People who had been withdrawn and subdued through winter's depth became more animated and hopeful. Conversations turned toward plans for spring work, the fields that would need ploughing, crops to be planted, construction projects to be undertaken, all the activities that had been impossible during frozen months but would soon become feasible again. Yet winter rarely surrendered without final demonstrations of power. March storms could be among the severest of the season, bringing heavy snow and bitter cold just when people thought they'd survived the worst. These late-season storms were particularly challenging psychologically because they came after hopes for spring had begun to build, crushing optimism and reminding everyone that nature's timeline didn't align with human wishes. Fuel supplies often ran critically low during late winter. Families who had calculated adequate wood for a normal winter found themselves short if the season proved longer or colder than average. The daily decision about how much wood to burn became agonizing, balancing immediate comfort against the risk of running out completely before spring made cutting additional supplies possible. Food supplies also dwindled as winter stretched on. Families had to make increasingly severe rationing decisions, stretching reduced rations even thinner to ensure something remained if winter lasted longer than hoped. People lost weight, their bodies consuming stored fat to compensate for inadequate nutrition. Children's growth slowed. Everyone felt constantly hungry, focused on food in ways that seemed to consume their thoughts. These late winter privations tested resilience in ways that earlier challenges hadn't. When families first entered winter, they'd possessed adequate supplies and energy. As weeks became months, cumulative deprivation wore down physical and psychological reserves. Small irritations that would have been ignored earlier in winter became sources of conflict. People snapped at each other over trivial matters, their patience eroded by constant hunger, cold, and confinement. Yet most families did survive. Through some combination of adequate preparation, luck, mutual support, and sheer stubborn determination, they endured winter's assault and lived to see spring's arrival. The exact date varied by location and year, but eventually, unmistakably, winter loosened its grip and the world began to thaw. The sound of running water, absent for months, returned as snow melted and streams began flowing again. This sound, so common during other seasons that it typically went unnoticed, seemed miraculous after winter's silence. Children were allowed outside for increasingly long periods as temperatures moderated and risks decreased. Their joy at being able to move freely after months of confinement was infectious, lifting everyone's spirits. Plants began responding to longer days and warming soil. The first green shoots pushing through dead vegetation seemed almost impossibly delicate and beautiful to people who had seen nothing but brown and white for months. These tiny evidences of life returning to the landscape represented profound hope, proof that the cycle of seasons continued, that life persisted despite winter's best efforts to extinguish it. Birds returned in greater numbers, their songs filling the air with sounds that seemed almost overwhelming after winter's quiet. The variety of species, each with distinct calls and behavior patterns, provided endless entertainment for people who had been starved for novelty and stimulation. Children learned to identify different species by their songs and habits, developing naturalist skills that would serve them throughout their lives. The work of spring began almost immediately, even before winter had completely released its hold. Fields needed to be prepared for planting, a task that couldn't wait for perfect conditions. Men hitched oxen or horses to wooden ploughs and began breaking ground that had frozen solid for months. The work was exhausting, requiring both human and animal labour pushed to their limits. Women turned their attention to gardens near the cabin, preparing soil for vegetables that would supplement the family's diet through summer and fall. Seeds that had been carefully saved from previous years or acquired through trade were planted with prayers for good germination and growth. Every seed represented potential food, making each one precious beyond its small size. The first fresh foods of spring, wild greens that appeared before cultivated crops, were eagerly gathered and consumed. Dandelion leaves, though considered weeds in later, more prosperous times, were prized for their vitamin content and fresh flavour after months of preserved foods. Watercress from streams, wild onions from meadows, young shoots of various plants, all contributed to diets deficient in fresh vegetables through winter months. Maple sugaring provided another early spring activity in regions where sugar maples grew. Families tapped trees in late winter or early spring when sap began flowing, but nights still froze. The sap was collected daily and boiled down in large kettles over outdoor fires, producing maple syrup or maple sugar that could be used for sweetening through the coming year. This work was labour-intensive, requiring enormous amounts of sap, roughly 40 gallons to produce 1 gallon of syrup to be collected and processed. But the result was valuable both as food and as a trade commodity. Families might consume some of their maple products while trading surplus for goods they couldn't produce themselves. Livestock that had survived winter began recovering their condition, as green grass returned and supplemental feeding could be reduced. Cows produced increasing amounts of milk. Chickens laid more eggs as daylight hours lengthened and their nutrition improved. Pigs could be turned out to forage in forests, feeding themselves on roots, nuts, and whatever else they could find while gaining weight that would make them valuable for fall slaughter. The social isolation of winter broke as travel became possible again. Families visited neighbours they hadn't seen for months, exchanging news, sharing supplies if anyone had suffered particular hardship, and simply enjoying human company beyond their immediate household. These reunions often became impromptu celebrations, occasions for sharing whatever food could be spared, and for collective relief at having survived another winter. Church services resumed where congregations existed, providing spiritual fellowship that many had missed during winter isolation. For some frontier families, particularly those from traditions emphasizing communal worship, the inability to attend services during winter had been a genuine hardship. The resumption of regular worship felt like restoration of important connection to both divine and human community. Work parties formed to assist families who had suffered particular hardships or who faced tasks too large for their own labour. Barn raisings, where entire communities gathered to construct a building in a single day, exemplified frontier cooperation. These events combined necessary work with social celebration, as women prepared communal meals and people caught up on months of news, while accomplishing tasks that would have taken individual families weeks. As settlers gained experience surviving frontier winters, they developed increasingly sophisticated strategies and accumulated knowledge that improved outcomes. The hardest years were typically the first few winters, when families were still learning what this particular climate and location demanded. Those who survived these early trials often prospered in subsequent years, having acquired expertise that made them valuable community resources. Indigenous peoples had been surviving these same winters for centuries or millennia before European colonization. Their accumulated knowledge represented deep understanding of local conditions, animal behavior, plant resources, and survival strategies. Settlers who were wise enough to learn from native peoples rather than dismissing their expertise gained enormous advantages. Relationships between settlers and indigenous peoples varied enormously by time, place, and the individuals involved. Some encounters were hostile, marked by conflict over land and resources. Others involved cooperation and mutual benefit, with native peoples trading furs, foods, and knowledge for manufactured goods like metal tools, cloth, and weapons. The displacement of indigenous peoples through treaty, purchase, or forceful removal created one of American history's great tragedies and injustices. But in the context of winter survival, it's important to acknowledge that much of what allowed European settlers to survive in unfamiliar climates came from native knowledge. Corn cultivation, preservation techniques, hunting strategies, clothing designs suited to extreme cold, medicinal plants, these and countless other elements of frontier survival had indigenous origins. Settler women sometimes formed particularly important relationships with native women, learning domestic arts and child-rearing practices adapted to frontier conditions. The sharing of knowledge about edible plants, food preservation, textile production, and herbal medicine crossed cultural boundaries in ways that benefited both groups. Though the asymmetric power dynamics of colonization meant native peoples rarely received fair compensation for their intellectual property. As decades passed and initial frontier regions became more settled, conditions improved significantly. Roads were built, connecting isolated homesteads to emerging towns and markets. Stores began carrying wider ranges of goods at lower prices as transportation infrastructure improved. Schools and churches were established, providing services that early settlers had lacked. The second generation of frontier families, children who had been born into frontier conditions or arrived so young they remembered nothing else, possessed advantages their parents lacked. They'd never known easier conditions, so they didn't experience frontier life as deprivation from some better previous existence. They'd learned survival skills from early childhood, developing competencies that adults trained in different environments struggled to master.
These second-generation settlers often proved
remarkably capable and resilient, combining their parents' knowledge with their own innovations. They experimented with new crops, building techniques, and community organization models. They maintained valued aspects of the culture their parents had brought from the East, while also developing distinctive frontier identities that reflected their unique experiences. Technology gradually improved winter survival prospects. Better stoves that heated more efficiently and safely became available. Glass windows became cheaper and more common, allowing natural light while maintaining thermal barriers. Metal tools improved in quality and availability. These changes didn't eliminate winter hardship, but they reduced its severity and improved survival rates. Agricultural knowledge accumulated through experience. Settlers learned which crop varieties performed best in local conditions. They discovered optimal planting and harvesting times. They developed pest management strategies and soil improvement techniques. This growing expertise increased yields, providing better nutrition and surplus that could be traded for other goods. The development of small-scale manufacturing in frontier regions provided new economic opportunities. Grist mills for grinding grain, sawmills for processing lumber, smithies for metalworking. These small industries created economic value while also providing services that made frontier life more manageable. Families could have their grain professionally milled rather than grinding it laboriously by hand, for example. Towns grew at strategic locations, crossroads, river fords, portage points between waterways. These communities became service centres for surrounding agricultural populations, offering merchants, craftsmen, professionals, and social institutions. The existence of nearby towns meant that frontier families weren't completely isolated, that emergency assistance or supplies might be obtainable even during winter if desperation warranted dangerous travel. The integration of frontier territories into larger economic and political systems brought both benefits and costs. Markets for agricultural products allowed families to generate cash income rather than merely subsisting. The ability to purchase goods produced elsewhere raised living standards, but market integration also created new vulnerabilities as families became dependent on economic systems they didn't control and couldn't fully understand. Financial panics and depressions, events originating in distant commercial centres, could devastate frontier families who had borrowed money for land or equipment. When prices for agricultural products collapsed or credit became unavailable, families who had been prospering could quickly find themselves facing foreclosure and the loss of everything they'd worked to build. The political incorporation of frontier territories, first as federal territories and eventually as states, brought government services but also government authority. Land titles had to be properly registered and taxes paid. Military conscription could remove young men from families that depended on their labour. Legal disputes had to be resolved through official channels rather than informal frontier justice. These changes represented the closing of the frontier, the transformation of wilderness into settled countryside integrated into larger social and economic systems. This process was neither uniformly good nor bad, but it fundamentally altered the nature of frontier experience. The winters of the 1850s differed significantly from those of the 1780s, not because climate had changed, but because human capacity to prepare for and endure winter had improved. Yet even as conditions improved in longer settled regions, the frontier itself moved westward. The pattern of migration, settlement, initial hardship, Gradual improvement repeated itself across the continent through the 19th century. Families who settled Ohio in the 1780s faced similar challenges to those who settled Kansas in the 1850s or Montana in the 1880s. Each new frontier presented its own particular challenges. The Great Plains offered vast open spaces but lacked timber for construction and fuel. The Mountain West provided spectacular scenery, but harsh climates and difficult terrain. The far northwest brought milder temperatures but also extraordinary rainfall and dense forests. Each region demanded adaptations to its specific conditions. The essential patterns remained consistent across these variations. Survival required careful preparation, adequate resources, practical skills, community cooperation, and psychological resilience. Families who possessed or developed these capacities generally survived and often prospered. Those who lacked them faced hardship that sometimes proved fatal. The stories of frontier winter survival that have come down to us through family histories, letters, diaries, and later recollections reveal both the worst and best of human nature. We see selfishness, as some families hoarded resources while neighbours suffered. We also see extraordinary generosity, as people shared limited supplies at risk to their own survival. We see despair, as individuals broke under the strain of isolation, deprivation, and loss. We also see remarkable courage, as ordinary people found strength they'd never suspected to endure circumstances that seemed impossible. We see conflicts, as families fractured under the stress of confinement and scarcity. We also see love, as parents sacrificed for children and spouses supported each other through unimaginable trials. These stories remind us that frontier settlers weren't uniformly heroic or virtuous. They were ordinary human beings facing extraordinary circumstances. Some rose to the occasion magnificently. Others failed in various ways. Most muddled through, doing their imperfect best under impossible conditions, making mistakes but also achieving successes, losing much but also gaining something in the process. The legacy of frontier winter survival extends far beyond the specific historical period we've been examining. The descendants of pioneer families carried forward both practical knowledge and psychological attitudes shaped by their ancestors' experiences. Values of self-reliance, careful preparation, community cooperation, and resilience became cultural touchstones in regions settled by frontier migration. These values influenced American culture more broadly, contributing to national narratives about independence, opportunity, and the frontier spirit. The mythology of the frontier, while often oversimplified and sometimes problematic, drew on real experiences of real people who had faced genuine challenges and developed genuine capabilities in response. Understanding how early American pioneers survived freezing frontier winters helps us appreciate both what we've gained through subsequent economic and technological development and what we may have lost. We've gained comfort, security, and material abundance that frontier families could barely imagine. We've lost some of the competence, community bonds, and psychological resilience that their conditions demanded. This isn't an argument for returning to frontier conditions, which involve genuine suffering that shouldn't be romanticized. But there's value in understanding what human beings are capable of when circumstances demand it. The pioneers who survived frontier winters discovered reserves of strength, creativity, and determination they'd never known they possessed. Their experiences remind us that we too might possess capabilities that remain hidden until tested by adversity. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps in a warm, comfortable room that would seem miraculous to frontier families, consider what they endured and achieved. Think about the mother who kept her children alive through months of hunger and cold, the father who ventured into blizzards to tend animals that meant the difference between survival and starvation, the children who learned to find joy and meaning despite deprivation that would seem unbearable by contemporary standards. These weren't superheroes from myth and legend. They were people fundamentally like ourselves, with similar hopes, fears, and capabilities. They face circumstances we hope never to experience, and through some combination of preparation, cooperation, luck, and sheer determination, most of them survived. Their story is part of your story, whether you're descended from frontier families or from peoples who came to America through different paths, or from anywhere else in the world. Because the fundamental human experiences they embodied, facing uncertainty, adapting to harsh conditions, supporting each other through hardship, finding meaning despite suffering, these are universal aspects of human existence across cultures and throughout history. Winter still comes to all of us eventually in one form or another. Economic hardship, health crises, personal losses, all the challenges that test our resilience and reveal our character. When your own winter arrives, you might draw strength from remembering those frontier families who faced literal winter without the resources, knowledge, and support systems we often take for granted. They discovered that human beings are tougher than we think, more adaptable than we imagine, more capable of endurance than we believe possible until tested. They learned that community matters more than individual strength, that preparation provides security, that hope sustains us through trials that seem unbearable. These lessons remain as relevant today as they were on the frontier centuries ago. The specific circumstances change, but the fundamental truths about human resilience, the importance of community, and the power of hope to sustain us through difficulty remain constant across time and culture. Sleep well, knowing that you carry within yourself the same capacity for survival and adaptation that enabled frontier families to endure those frozen months when nature seemed determined to prove that humans had no business attempting to live in such harsh conditions. They proved nature wrong through their stubborn refusal to surrender, their willingness to learn and adapt, and their commitment to supporting each other through shared trials. The frontier is closed now, the wilderness settled, the hardships largely ameliorated by technology and economic development. But the human spirit that enabled survival in those conditions persists, waiting to be called upon whenever circumstances demand it. That spirit is your inheritance, regardless of your specific ancestry, a birthright of being human that connects you to every person who has ever faced adversity and found the strength to persevere. As you sink into sleep's embrace, let go of whatever worries or concerns occupy your waking mind. Trust that you, like those frontier families long ago, possess resources you've never had to access, strengths you've never been forced to demonstrate, capabilities that remain dormant until circumstances require their activation. The cycle of seasons continues as it always has. Winter comes, tests everything living, and eventually yields to spring's renewal. This pattern plays out in human lives as it does in nature, bringing challenges that seem overwhelming but also opportunities for growth that wouldn't exist without the testing. The pioneers survived their winters. You will survive yours. and in the surviving you may discover, as they did, that you're stronger than you knew, more capable than you imagined, more resilient than you believed possible. That discovery, hard won through difficulty, becomes its own reward, a gift that couldn't be acquired any easier way. Rest now, letting these stories of survival and resilience carry you gently towards sleep, knowing that the same human capacity for endurance that sustained families through frozen frontier winters lives within you, ready to support you through whatever challenges your own life may bring. The morning routines that sustained frontier families through winter months deserve deeper examination, for they reveal how ordinary people transformed survival into something approaching normalcy through the power of habit and ritual. When we understand these daily patterns, we begin to see how psychological resilience was built not through dramatic heroism, but through the steady repetition of small, necessary actions that gave structure to days that might otherwise have dissolved into formless suffering. The person responsible for fire maintenance, typically rising an hour or more before anyone else, faced one of winter's most crucial and unforgiving tasks. The fire that had been carefully banked the previous evening needed to be coaxed back to life while the cabin's interior temperature often hovered near freezing. This work required moving quickly despite cold-numbed fingers, arranging kindling with precision despite darkness broken only by dim coals, and maintaining focus despite the powerful temptation to retreat back to bed's relative warmth. The technique for reviving a banked fire was something of an art form, learned through practice and occasionally through the harsh lesson of complete failure. The person tending the fire would first carefully remove the layer of ash that had been spread over the coals to slow their consumption of oxygen. Beneath this protective layer, if everything had been done correctly the night before, glowing coals remained viable, holding enough heat to ignite fresh fuel. Small pieces of dry kindling, preferably pine or other resinous wood that caught fire easily, would be arranged in a careful architecture that allowed air circulation while concentrating heat. The arrangement mattered tremendously. Too dense and the kindling would smother. Too loose and heat would dissipate before achieving sustained combustion. The experienced fire tender developed an intuitive sense for the correct balance, adjusting techniques based on the specific wood available and the particular behavior of their individual fireplace. As the kindling began to catch, slightly larger pieces would be added gradually, building the fire's intensity in stages rather than attempting to achieve full heat immediately. Rushing this process was a common mistake among inexperienced pioneers, resulting in fires that produced more smoke than heat, or that consumed fuel too quickly. The patient, methodical approach that seemed painfully slow when you were shivering in the pre-dawn cold actually proved more efficient in the long term. Once the fire was burning reliably, the fire tender would add larger logs, positioning them to maximize heat radiation into the room, while ensuring adequate airflow to maintain combustion. The logs' arrangement affected both the immediate warmth produced and the rate of fuel consumption. Logs placed too close together burned hotter but faster. Logs placed too far apart produced less heat but lasted longer. Finding the optimal balance for different times of day and different weather conditions represented accumulated wisdom that took years to develop fully. While the fire was being restored to life, other family members gradually stirred from sleep. The psychological transition from the cocoon of blankets and shared body heat to the harsh reality of a frigid cabin required its own form of courage. Children especially struggled with this transition, and parents developed various strategies for motivating them to leave bed's warmth and begin the day's activities. Some families made a game of dressing, challenging children to see who could get dressed most quickly. Others used food as motivation, promising breakfast to those who dressed promptly. Still others simply maintained firm expectations, communicating through tone and example that staying in bed wasn't an option, regardless of how unpleasant the alternative might be. These different approaches reflected both personality differences among parents and broader philosophies about child rearing and discipline. The clothing worn by frontier families during winter months layered in ways that modern people might find uncomfortable, but that provided essential protection against cold. The base layer typically consisted of linen undergarments, shirts and drawers that absorbed perspiration while providing a first barrier against cold. Over this went wool outer garments, trousers or skirts, shirts or dresses, chosen for durability and warmth rather than style or comfort. Additional layers were added as needed based on whether someone would be working inside or venturing outdoors. Heavy wool coats, often homemade from fabric woven by the family, provided outer protection. Scarves or mufflers wrapped around necks and lower faces prevented breathing extremely cold air, while also protecting exposed skin from frostbite. Mittens, usually preferred over gloves because they allowed fingers to share warmth, protected hands from cold that could cause frostbite in minutes during the severest weather. Footwear required particular attention because feet were especially vulnerable to cold and moisture. Wool socks, often worn in multiple layers, provided insulation. Boots had to be substantial enough to keep out snow and cold, while remaining flexible enough to allow walking. Many frontier families stuffed boots with dried grass or moss to provide additional insulation, a technique borrowed from indigenous peoples who had developed it through centuries of experience with extreme cold. The preparation of breakfast, while the fire was building strength and the family was assembling, represented more than simply feeding hungry people. The ritual of meal preparation and consumption together provided psychological structure that helped differentiate one day from another and created moments of family connection that countered the isolation of winter existence. The menu for breakfast varied based on available supplies and family preferences, but certain foods appeared with such regularity that they became synonymous with frontier winter meals. Cornmeal mush, mentioned earlier, was nearly universal. The preparation was straightforward, requiring only cornmeal, water, salt if available, and heat. The mixture would be stirred constantly to prevent burning while it thickened into a porridge-like consistency. The resulting dish was filling if not particularly exciting, providing calories and some nutritional value, while consuming relatively little fuel for cooking. Families developed individual variations, some adding small amounts of maple syrup or honey when available, others incorporating bits of salt pork for flavor and fat, still others eating it plain and saving flavoring ingredients for other meals. Leftover mush from previous meals could be sliced and fried, creating a different texture and flavor that provided variety from the same basic ingredient. This transformation of yesterday's breakfast into today's demonstrated the creativity and resourcefulness that frontier cooking demanded. Nothing could be wasted, and ingredients had to be stretched and reimagined constantly to prevent both physical hunger and psychological monotony. Salt pork, a staple of frontier diets, appeared at breakfast when families could afford to consume it. A few thin slices fried in a pan provided precious fat and protein, while rendering grease that would be carefully saved and used for cooking other meals. The rendered fat, precious as gold in frontier households, could be used for frying, added to cornbread for moisture and flavour, or spread on bread as a substitute for butter when actual dairy products weren't available. Eggs, when chickens continued laying through winter, were treated as special treasures. The decision to consume an egg rather than allowing it to potentially hatch and increase the flock represented economic calculation that modern people rarely face. Some families ate eggs freely during periods of abundance, preserving some in water glass, a solution of sodium silicate that sealed shells and prevented spoilage for months. Others rationed eggs carefully, allowing each family member perhaps 1 or 2 per week as a special treat. Bread, when flour was available, appeared at most meals. The bread of frontier households bore little resemblance to the soft uniform products modern people know. Frontier bread was dense and heavy, made from coarsely ground corn or wheat flour, often incorporating portions of bran and germ that commercial milling would later remove. The texture could be tough and the flavour strong, but bread provided bulk and nutrition, while also serving as an edible utensil for scooping up stews or other semi-liquid foods. The baking of bread required careful management of fire temperature, another skill that took experience to master. The fireplace had to be heated to the appropriate level, then the coals raked aside to create a space for the bread pan or directly for loaves placed on heated stones. The bread had to cook evenly without burning, requiring attention and occasionally repositioning to ensure all sides received adequate heat. Dutch ovens, heavy cast iron pots with fitted lids, revolutionized frontier baking when families could afford them. These vessels could be placed directly in the fire with coals heaped on top of the lid, creating an oven-like environment that baked bread more reliably than open-fire techniques. A good Dutch oven became a family treasure, maintained carefully and passed down through generations as both practical tool and symbolic heirloom. After breakfast, with the fire burning steadily and everyone fed and dressed, the day's work began in earnest. The division of labour in frontier households followed patterns that seem rigid by contemporary standards, but that reflected practical necessities and cultural expectations of the era. Men's work focused on activities requiring physical strength and involving outdoor exposure to harsh conditions. Women's work centered on household management and activities that could be performed primarily indoors. This division wasn't absolute, and frontier conditions often demanded flexibility. Women sometimes helped with outdoor work when extra hands were needed urgently. Men occasionally assisted with traditionally female tasks when circumstances required it. But the basic pattern held across most frontier households, shaped by both practical considerations and deeply held beliefs about appropriate gender roles. The men's journey outside to tend livestock represented one of winter's daily trials that had to be faced regardless of weather or personal inclination. Animals couldn't feed themselves or obtain water from frozen sources without human intervention. Their survival, which directly affected the family's survival, depended on daily care that couldn't be postponed or shirked, regardless of conditions. The walk from cabin to barn or livestock shelter, which might be only 50 or 60 feet, could become genuinely dangerous during severe weather. Blizzards that reduced visibility to zero made navigation by sight impossible. Men learned to count their steps, knowing that the barn was exactly 47 steps in a particular direction, or they held onto guide ropes that prevented disorientation and wandering. Stories of men found frozen within sight of safety, having become confused in whiteout conditions and walked in circles until cold claimed them, were common enough to create genuine fear of venturing outside during the worst weather. Yet the work had to be done. Animals would die without care, and their death would often mean the family's starvation or inability to work their land when spring arrived. Inside the barn or shelter, conditions were marginally better than outdoors, but far from comfortable. Body heat from livestock raised the temperature somewhat, and the building's walls provided some protection from wind. But the interior was still bitterly cold, often well below freezing, and the work required exposed hands that became painful within minutes, despite mittens that had to be removed for precise tasks. Feeding livestock consumed stored hay or other feed that had been laboriously gathered and preserved during warmer months. The daily ration had to be carefully calculated to provide adequate nutrition, while stretching limited supplies through winter's uncertain duration. Too little feed and animals would weaken or die. Too much and supplies might run out before spring, with the same ultimate result. Water presented constant challenges. Livestock required substantial quantities, and keeping water liquid in freezing conditions demanded daily effort. Some families were fortunate enough to have access to springs that flowed year-round despite cold. Others had to chop through ice on streams or ponds, a task that became more difficult as winter progressed and ice grew thicker. The chopping of ice was back-breaking work, requiring swinging an axe or ice chisel repeatedly to penetrate ice that could be 6 inches thick or more. The effort had to be repeated daily because water that was accessed would freeze again overnight, sometimes forming even thicker ice than before because the chopping process spread water onto surrounding ice, where it immediately froze as the bitter cold. Some ingenious pioneers developed techniques for keeping at least a small section of water ice-free through constant vigilance. A floating wooden disc or block of wood could prevent complete freezing if checked and cleared multiple times daily. Insulating hay or straw piled around water containers helped slow freezing. But these methods required constant attention and never provided complete solutions to the water problem. Monitoring animal health during these daily visits represented another crucial responsibility. Livestock that became ill or injured during winter faced poor survival odds, and their loss could devastate a family's economic situation. Men learned to recognize early signs of illness, changes in behavior or appetite, physical symptoms like discharge from eyes or nose, lethargy or unusual aggression. Treatment options were limited but not non-existent. Some herbal remedies used for humans could be adapted for animals. Keeping sick animals warm and hydrated gave their bodies the best chance to fight infection. Isolating sick animals prevented disease from spreading to the entire herd. But despite best efforts, animals sometimes died, and their loss had to be absorbed as one of winter's inevitable casualties. The chickens, if the family kept them through winter, required special attention because they were more vulnerable to cold than larger livestock. Some families brought chickens into the cabin at night during the severest cold, accepting the noise and mess for the sake of preserving valuable egg production. Others built insulated chicken coops and provided extra feed to help birds generate body heat through metabolism. The decision about whether to keep chickens through winter involved complex calculations. Birds consumed feed that had to be stored and protected. They required daily care in harsh conditions. They might die anyway despite all efforts, representing wasted resources. But they also provided eggs, a precious source of protein and fat during months when such foods were otherwise scarce. Families had to weigh these factors based on their particular situation and resources. After completing morning livestock care, men returned to the cabin to warm themselves before undertaking the day's other tasks. This warming period wasn't simply luxury or self-indulgence, but genuine necessity. Fingers and toes that had become dangerously cold needed to be carefully rewarmed before frostbite could cause permanent damage. The process was painful, the screaming mimes of returning circulation causing intense prickling sensations that could last for many minutes. The remainder of the men's day might be spent on various maintenance and construction tasks. Tool sharpening was endless work because axes, knives, and other edge tools dulled with use and had to be constantly maintained. The sharpening process used various grades of stones, coarse stones for initial shaping and finer stones for final honing, working the blade across the stone at precise angles that required skill to maintain consistently. Other tools required different maintenance. Saw blades had to be sharpened with special files, working on each tooth individually to restore its cutting edge. Plough blades might need hammering on an anvil to restore their shape after striking rocks. Broken handles had to be replaced using wood that had been seasoned and shaped. Every tool represented significant investment, and maintaining them properly meant the difference between having functional equipment when needed or being unable to work. The construction of new tools and household items from raw materials occupied many winter hours. A man with woodworking skills could produce a remarkable variety of useful objects: handles for axes and hammers, spindles for spinning wool, furniture pieces to replace items that had worn out, children's toys, spoons and bowls for kitchen use. All these and countless other items could be carved or assembled from wood during winter months when outdoor work was impossible. The skills required for this work weren't trivial or quickly learned. Selecting appropriate wood for different purposes required understanding various species' characteristics. Oak's strength made it suitable for tool handles that would endure heavy stress. Pine's workability made it appropriate for items requiring detailed carving. Hickory's flexibility and resilience made it ideal for applications requiring spring and shock absorption. The shaping of wood required various cutting and carving tools, each suited to particular tasks. Draw knives removed large amounts of material quickly. Chisels provided precision for detailed work. Planes smoothed surfaces to final finishes. Saws allowed cutting of specific shapes and sizes. A well-equipped frontier household might own a dozen or more specialized woodworking tools, each maintained carefully and used with respect for its particular capabilities. Leatherworking represented another valuable skill set that men practiced during winter months. Hides from animals slaughtered for food needed to be processed into usable leather for boots, gloves, harness components, and countless other applications. The tanning process, when done properly, transformed raw hide into durable, flexible material that would last for years. Various tanning methods existed, each with advantages and disadvantages. Vegetable tanning used tannins from tree bark, creating leather that was firm and water-resistant. Brain tanning, a method used by many indigenous peoples, produced softer, more flexible leather by using emulsified brains from the animal itself. chemical tanning using lime or other agents provided different characteristics. The choice of method depended on intended use, available materials, and the tanner's skill and knowledge. A family might use different methods for different purposes, brain tanning deer skin for soft gloves, while vegetable tanning cowhide for boot leather. The accumulated knowledge required to make these decisions correctly represented significant intellectual capital that distinguished successful frontier families from those who struggled. While men worked on these various tasks, women maintained equally demanding schedules focused on household management and family care. The preparation of the midday meal began hours in advance, as cooking methods available to frontier women required long, slow processes rather than the quick preparation modern cooking allows. A stew or soup, standard fare for frontier dinners, began with basic ingredients that seemed unpromising in their raw state, but that transformed through long cooking into satisfying meals. Dried beans had to be soaked overnight to soften them enough for cooking. Salt pork had to be sliced and fried to render its fat. Dried vegetables had to be reconstituted in water. All these preparatory steps required time and attention before actual cooking could begin. The cooking itself took place in heavy iron pots, suspended over the fire or nestled into coals. Temperature control was achieved through pot positioning and fire management, rather than through the precise thermostats of modern stoves. Women learned to judge cooking temperatures by various indicators: the sound of bubbling, the appearance of the pot's contents, the smell of cooking food. These judgments required experience that was typically passed from mother to daughter through years of observation and practice. A girl would begin helping with cooking as soon as she could safely work near the fire, perhaps at 5 or 6 years old. She would gradually learn to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when food was cooking too fast or too slow, when more fuel needed to be added to the fire, when pots needed to be moved to different heat zones. The skills involved in frontier cooking extended far beyond following recipes. Women had to understand how different ingredients behaved under various conditions, how altitude affected cooking times and temperatures, how humidity influenced bread rising and preservation, how seasonal variations in ingredients required adjustments to familiar processes. This knowledge accumulated through experience and was refined through experimentation and shared information among women in frontier communities. Bread baking, mentioned earlier in the context of breakfast, often occurred during the middle part of the day when fire had been burning long enough to achieve steady temperatures. The mixing of dough required judgment about flour quantity and water amount, because the precise ratios varied based on flour coarseness, humidity levels, and other factors that couldn't be exactly measured. The kneading of dough developed gluten structure that determined bread's final texture. Too little kneading resulted in bread that crumbled and lacked cohesion. Too much kneading created tough, dense bread. The correct amount had to be judged by the dough's feel and appearance, something experienced bakers knew intuitively, but that novices struggled to master. The rising of bread dough, powered by yeast that was typically maintained as a sourdough starter from batch to batch, required warmth that could be challenging to provide in frontier cabins. Women learned to place rising dough in the warmest available locations near the fire, but not so close that heat would kill the yeast organisms. The dough's progress had to be monitored regularly, ready for baking when it had roughly doubled in volume. Sewing and mending continued as constant background activities throughout the day. Clothing wore out relentlessly under frontier conditions, developing holes and tears that needed immediate repair before they could enlarge and make the garment unusable. Women kept baskets of mending beside their chairs, working on repairs during any spare moments between other tasks. The darning of socks was particularly endless work because feet rubbing constantly inside boots quickly wore through heels and toes. The darning process interwove new yarn or thread across the whole, creating a patch that was ideally strong enough to endure continued use. A well-darned sock might last for months of additional wear, while a poorly darned one would fail almost immediately. The making of new clothing from raw materials represented major projects that consumed weeks or months. Spinning wool into thread required hours of work with a spinning wheel or hand spindle, gradually transforming loose fibre into continuous strand suitable for weaving or knitting. The thread's thickness and consistency affected the final fabric's characteristics, requiring attention and skill to maintain uniform quality. Weaving thread into fabric used looms that ranged from simple frame looms for small pieces to complex floor looms capable of producing substantial yardage. The weaving process created fabric by interlacing warp threads, which ran the length of the cloth, with weft threads that crossed perpendicular. Different weaving patterns created different fabric characteristics, from simple plain weave to complex patterns that produced decorative effects. Not all frontier families owned looms or possessed weaving skills. Fabric was sometimes purchased from travelling merchants or acquired through trade with families who specialised in textile production. But purchased fabric was expensive relative to frontier families' cash income, making home production economically essential for many households. Knitting provided an alternative method for creating fabric from yarn, particularly useful for items like socks, mittens, and sweaters that needed to be form-fitting and elastic. The knitting process created interlocking loops of yarn that could stretch and flex while maintaining their structure. Learning to knit required developing muscle memory for the repetitive motions, while also maintaining attention to the pattern being created. Many frontier women could knit while doing other activities, walking, supervising children, even conversing, because the basic motions became so automatic. This ability to multitask allowed productive use of time that might otherwise have been consumed by activities requiring full attention. A woman could knit an entire sock during evening hours across a few days, creating necessary items without dedicating separate time exclusively to the task. Childcare wove through all these activities as a constant additional responsibility. Young children required supervision to keep them safe from fire, scalding water, and other household hazards. They needed help with dressing, washing, and toileting. They became hungry between meals and needed small snacks to tide them over. They had conflicts with siblings that required adult intervention. Mothers developed remarkable abilities to maintain awareness of children's activities while simultaneously working on other tasks. A mother baking bread would instinctively note changes in the quality of children's play sounds in another part of the cabin, recognizing shifts from constructive play to arguments or dangerous activities. This divided attention was exhausting to maintain constantly, but it was simply part of the reality of motherhood in conditions where children and work occupied the same small space. The education of children mentioned earlier continued through winter as an ongoing project rather than a structured activity. Children absorbed lessons through participation in household work, learning by doing while contributing to family welfare. A girl helping her mother with cooking learned not just specific recipes, but broader principles of heat management, ingredient combination, and planning. A boy working with his father on tool maintenance learned not only how to sharpen an axe, but also how to evaluate whether an edge was properly formed, how to identify when a blade had been damaged beyond simple sharpening, and how to prevent damage through proper use and storage. These practical lessons formed an education more relevant to frontier life than formal schooling in academic subjects, though families who valued literacy and numeracy tried to provide both. The afternoon hours brought continuation of morning patterns with subtle shifts in specific activities. Men might return from morning's outdoor work to indoor projects, or they might venture out again for hunting if weather and game availability made it worthwhile. Women progressed from midday meal to its cleanup, and then to preparation for the evening meal, a cycle that repeated with variations 6 or 7 days per week throughout winter. The monotony of this repetition was both challenge and comfort. The predictability of daily patterns provided psychological structure that helped people maintain equilibrium during months of confinement. But the sameness could also become oppressive, creating feelings of being trapped in endless cycles where nothing ever changed, and spring seemed like a fantasy that might never actually arrive. Families developed various strategies for breaking, or at least varying, the monotony. Some designated certain days for specific activities beyond the daily necessities. Monday might be laundry day when enough water could be heated despite the extra fuel consumption. Tuesday might focus on baking, producing a week's worth of bread in a single concentrated effort. Friday might include extra cabin cleaning to prepare for Sabbath rest. These specialized days provided structure that made one day meaningfully different from another, creating psychological markers that helped time feel less like an undifferentiated blur. Even the anticipation of a different activity the next day provided something to look forward to, a small hope that countered the deadening sameness of winter routines. Special treats and celebrations, even tiny ones, served similar purposes. A mother might surprise children with molasses candy made from hoarded sweetener. A father might carve a new toy as an unexpected gift. These small pleasures, which would barely register in more comfortable circumstances, became genuine highlights during winter's privation. Religious observance, mentioned earlier as providing Sabbath rest, also created weekly rhythms that structured time and provided meaning beyond mere survival. Families who maintained regular devotional practices found that these activities connected them to purposes larger than their immediate circumstances. Prayer and scripture reading reminded them that their struggles were temporary, that spiritual concerns transcended physical hardship, that they were part of communities and traditions that extended beyond their isolated cabin. For some families, faith provided the primary source of hope and resilience during winter's trials. The belief that God watched over them, that their suffering had meaning in a divine plan, that they would be rewarded for their endurance. These convictions sustained people through circumstances that might otherwise have broken their will to continue. For others, religious practice was more cultural than deeply personal, maintained more from habit and social expectation than from intense spiritual conviction. But even for these families, the rituals of worship provided structure and connection to cultural identity that helped maintain psychological equilibrium during isolation. As afternoon yielded to evening, the quality of light in the cabin changed dramatically. Winter days in northern latitudes were short, with sunset occurring as early as 4:30 or 5 o'clock. The transition from daylight to darkness happened quickly, and families had to adjust their activities to match declining illumination. Activities requiring good light had to be completed before sunset, because artificial lighting from candles or oil lamps, while adequate for basic illumination, wasn't sufficient for detailed work. A woman doing intricate sewing would finish that task before darkness made it impossible to see fine stitches. A man carving wood would complete detailed work before shadows made precise cuts dangerous. The lighting of evening lamps or candles was delayed as long as possible to conserve expensive fuels. Families grew accustomed to working in twilight conditions that modern people would find unbearably dim. They positioned themselves near windows to capture every last bit of natural light, and they developed the ability to perform familiar tasks by feel when vision became inadequate. When artificial light finally became necessary, it was used sparingly. A single candle or lamp might provide all the illumination for an entire family's evening activities. People gathered in the pool of light it created, their faces illuminated while the cabin's corners remained in darkness. This concentrated gathering created intimacy that modern families rarely experience, everyone drawn together by the practical necessity of sharing limited light. The evening meal, typically the day's most substantial, brought the family together for food and companionship after a day of largely separate activities. Even in the single room of a frontier cabin, men's and women's work often proceeded relatively independently during daylight hours. Evening dinner provided opportunity for conversation and connection that reaffirmed family bonds. The meal itself might not be elaborate, perhaps the stew that had been cooking slowly all day, cornbread from the afternoon's baking, perhaps dried apple slices as a small dessert if supplies allowed such luxury. But the ritual of sitting together, of sharing food and conversation, provided psychological nourishment as important as the physical sustenance the meal provided. Conversation during and after dinner helped families process their experiences and maintain connections with each other. Parents asked children about their day, what they had learned or accomplished, what challenges they had faced. Siblings shared their activities and concerns. Everyone discussed plans for the next day's work and activities. These conversations served multiple purposes beyond simple information exchange. They provided emotional support, validating each person's experiences and efforts. They helped resolve conflicts that had emerged during the day, allowing people to express grievances and negotiate solutions. They taught communication skills that would serve children throughout their lives. The hours after dinner, before bed, were often the day's most pleasant period despite winter's cold and darkness. The work was done or at least paused. The family was gathered together in the fire's warmth and light. The atmosphere could become almost cozy despite physical circumstances that were objectively harsh. This was the time for stories, music, reading aloud, games, and other activities that provided entertainment and culture beyond simple survival. Parents told stories from their own childhoods, or from family history stretching back generations. Children listened with rapt attention to tales of ancestors' adventures and struggles, absorbing family lore that connected them to their heritage. Music, for families who possessed instruments and musical ability, transformed evening hours into something approaching magic. A fiddle's voice singing out familiar melodies created beauty that seemed to push back against winter's grimness. Family members might dance in the limited space, a few moments of physical joy and connection that lifted everyone's spirits. Singing required no instruments and was therefore available to even the poorest families. Folk songs passed down through generations, hymns learned in childhood, popular ballads brought from Europe or created in America, all these formed a shared cultural heritage that united communities despite geographic isolation. A family singing together created harmony both musical and emotional, a reminder that they were more than simply individuals struggling to survive, but a unified group facing challenges together. Reading aloud for families with books and literate members provided access to worlds beyond their cabin walls. A novel's story could transport listeners to distant places and times, providing psychological escape from winter's confinement. Poetry offered compressed beauty and meaning that could be contemplated and discussed. Historical or biographical works educated while entertaining, teaching about human experiences across times and cultures. The choice of reading material revealed families' values and interests. Some read primarily religious texts, finding in scripture and devotional writings the spiritual nourishment they craved. Others preferred practical works, agricultural manuals or medical guides that taught useful skills and knowledge. Still others sought entertainment and escape in novels or adventure stories that provided dramatic alternatives to their mundane reality. Games provided another form of evening entertainment. Simple board games, card games, or word games could be played by firelight with minimal equipment. Children learned strategy and social skills through gameplay, while also burning mental energy that helped them settle for sleep. Adults found in games a form of mental stimulation that countered the psychological dullness of winter routine. The transition to sleep began gradually as evening wore on. Small children would become drowsy first, their energy depleted by the day's activities. Parents would help them undress and get into bed, tucking them under layers of quilts and blankets that would keep them warm through the night. Sometimes the entire family would sleep together in a single large bed, sharing body heat that supplemented inadequate bedding. Before sleep, the fire had to be banked for the night, a crucial task that would determine whether morning would bring viable coals or cold ashes requiring fire to be restarted from scratch. The banking process involved arranging logs for slow, sustained burning, then covering them with a layer of ash that would restrict oxygen and slow combustion rate dramatically. The person responsible for this task developed judgment about exactly how to arrange and cover the fire based on weather conditions, wood type, and expected sleeping duration. Too little ash and the fire would burn too hot, consuming fuel quickly and potentially dying before morning. Too much ash and combustion might cease entirely, requiring morning restart with attendant difficulty and discomfort. With the fire properly banked, the family would settle for sleep, their day complete. The cabin would grow increasingly cold as the night progressed, and the banked fire provided only minimal heat. People sleeping near the fire would be relatively comfortable. Those farther away would feel cold creeping in despite blankets and shared body warmth. Yet sleep came relatively easily for most frontier families despite cold and discomfort. Physical exhaustion from the day's labor made sleep a biological necessity rather than an optional luxury. People learned to sleep through cold that would seem intolerable to those accustomed to heated homes. The human body's remarkable adaptability allowed adjustment to circumstances that initially seemed impossible to endure. And so the cycle would repeat, day after day, week after week, month after month. The routines that seemed almost unbearably monotonous were precisely what enabled survival. The repetition created efficiency, allowing tasks to be accomplished with minimum wasted motion or time. The predictability provided psychological stability, preventing the disorientation that could result from constant novelty and uncertainty. Through these mundane daily patterns, through countless small actions repeated thousands of times, frontier families transformed survival from desperate struggle into sustainable routine. They proved that human beings could adapt to circumstances that initially seemed impossibly harsh, that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capacities for endurance when necessity demanded it. The winter eventually ended, as it always did. Spring returned with its promise of renewal and its opportunities for different activities and experiences. But the families who emerged from winter's trial were not quite the same people who had entered it months earlier. They had been tested and had discovered what they were capable of enduring. They had learned lessons about themselves, their families, and human nature that would shape the rest of their lives. And somewhere in your own life, perhaps you face your own winter, your own period of testing and trial. The specific circumstances differ vastly from frontier conditions, but the fundamental human experiences remain surprisingly similar. We all face challenges that seem impossible to endure. We all discover through adversity that we're stronger than we knew. We all learn that connection with others and maintenance of hope sustain us through trials that might otherwise overwhelm us. Rest now, knowing that you carry within yourself the same human capacity for adaptation and resilience that sustained those frontier families through frozen months when survival itself seemed miraculous. Your challenges may take different forms, but the strength to face them lives within you, waiting to be discovered when circumstances demand its expression. Sleep peacefully, trusting that you, like countless humans before you, will find the resources needed to endure whatever winter you face, and that spring will eventually come again, as it always does, bringing renewal and the opportunity to grow from the trials you've survived. The psychological dimensions of frontier winter survival deserve even deeper exploration, for they reveal truths about human nature that transcend the specific historical context. When we examine how people maintained their mental health and emotional equilibrium during months of isolation, deprivation, and constant stress, we discover coping mechanisms and resilient strategies that remain relevant across time and circumstance. The impact of prolonged isolation on human psychology cannot be overstated. Modern research has demonstrated that humans are profoundly social creatures who require regular interaction with others beyond their immediate household to maintain optimal mental health. Frontier families during winter often went weeks or even months without seeing another human being outside their own cabin walls. This degree of isolation created psychological pressures that affected different people in markedly different ways. For some individuals, particularly those with introverted temperaments or contemplative natures, the isolation was not entirely unwelcome. These people found in winter's enforced solitude an opportunity for reflection and inner development that the busy social life of warmer seasons didn't permit. They used the long, quiet hours to think deeply about philosophical and spiritual questions, to develop their understanding of themselves and their place in the universe, to cultivate interior richness that compensated for exterior deprivation. For others, especially those with more extroverted personalities who drew energy from social interaction, the isolation was agonizing. These individuals experienced winter as a form of imprisonment, counting the days until they could resume normal social engagement. They struggled with depression, irritability, and a sense of suffocation that no amount of rational understanding could entirely dispel. They needed external stimulation and variety that winter simply could not provide. Children's psychological experiences of winter isolation varied dramatically by age and individual temperament. Very young children, those under perhaps 4 or 5 years old, often adapted relatively well because they had limited memory of different conditions, and their psychological needs were primarily met through parental attention. As long as parents remained emotionally available and responsive, young children could thrive even in confined circumstances. Older children and adolescents faced more significant challenges. They possessed enough cognitive development to understand what they were missing in terms of friendship, adventure, and independence, but they lacked the emotional regulation skills that adults had developed through experience. The result was often moodiness, conflict with siblings and parents, and behavioral problems that made an already difficult situation more stressful for everyone. Parents struggling with their own psychological challenges, while also managing children's emotional needs, faced extraordinary demands. A mother who was herself battling depression or anxiety had to somehow find the emotional resources to soothe a frightened child, mediate conflicts between siblings, and maintain household routines. A father wrestling with fears about his ability to keep his family alive through winter still had to project confidence and strength that would reassure his children and wife. The intimate proximity of family members living in a single room for months created both opportunities and challenges for relationships. On one hand, the shared experience of enduring hardship together could forge bonds of extraordinary depth and strength. Families who successfully navigated winter's trials often emerged with enhanced appreciation for each other and stronger relationships built on mutual support through difficulty. On the other hand, the constant togetherness with no possibility of privacy or personal space could exacerbate conflicts and magnify minor irritations into major sources of tension. Habits that might be merely annoying when people could escape each other's presence became nearly intolerable when escape was impossible. A husband's way of eating, a wife's manner of speaking, a child's restless movements, any of these could become sources of disproportionate irritation when there was no respite from constant exposure. Successful frontier families developed various strategies for managing these tensions. Some families established rules about personal space, designating certain areas or times when individuals could be left alone despite physical proximity. Others created routines that gave people predictable breaks from interaction, even if those breaks were more psychological than physical. The concept of going outside in your mind was something many frontier residents practiced, though they might not have used that specific terminology. When physical escape was impossible, people learned to create mental distance through imagination and memory. A woman might recall in vivid detail a pleasant summer day, mentally revisiting the sensations and experiences until she achieved temporary psychological relief from winter's confinement. Men sometimes used physical work as a form of meditation, losing themselves in the repetitive rhythms of chopping wood or carving, achieving a mental state where concerns and anxieties receded into the background. This wasn't escape in the sense of avoiding reality, but rather a healthy form of psychological self-regulation that prevented the build-up of stress that could lead to breakdown. The phenomenon we might now call cabin fever was well recognized by frontier residents, though they used different terms to describe it. They understood that prolonged confinement could lead to irrational behavior, emotional volatility, and impaired judgment. Experienced frontiersmen warned newcomers about these risks and taught strategies for prevention and management. One crucial strategy was maintaining routines and structure, even when external circumstances provided few natural markers to differentiate one day from another. Families that let their daily patterns dissolve into formless existence often experienced more severe psychological problems than those who maintained strict schedules. The discipline of rising at a consistent time, performing work according to established patterns, and retiring at predictable hours provided psychological anchoring that prevented disorientation. Physical exercise, even within the confined space of a cabin, helped maintain mental health by providing an outlet for physical energy and stress. Children especially needed opportunities to move their bodies vigorously, and creative parents found ways to accommodate this need. Indoor games that involved running or jumping, dance sessions during evening hours, even organized work projects that required physical exertion, all served partly to provide exercise that prevented the restlessness and agitation that could result from forced sedentary existence. The importance of light, both natural and artificial, in maintaining psychological well-being was not fully understood during the frontier era, but people recognized intuitively that darkness affected mood. Families made efforts to maximize natural light during daytime hours, keeping windows as clear as possible despite frost accumulation, positioning work areas to capture available sunlight, and spending time near windows even when this meant working in colder areas of the cabin. The timing of artificial lighting in evening hours involved balancing economic concerns about fuel consumption against psychological needs for illumination. Some families practiced extreme economy, using almost no artificial light and retiring to bed shortly after sunset. Others judged that the mental health benefits of extended evening hours with adequate light justified somewhat greater fuel consumption. These different choices reflected varying resources, priorities, and philosophies. The content of thoughts during long winter hours deserves consideration. What did frontier people think about when they had extensive time for contemplation? The answer varied enormously by individual education, temperament, and circumstances, but certain themes appeared repeatedly in the letters, diaries, and later reminiscences that documented frontier experience. Many people spent considerable time mentally reviewing their lives, evaluating the choices that had brought them to the frontier, and considering whether those choices had been wise. This retrospective analysis could be either constructive or destructive. Some people used it to achieve greater self-understanding and to identify lessons that would guide future decisions. Others spiraled into regret and self-recrimination that served no constructive purpose. Forward-looking thoughts focused on plans for spring and summer, the crops to be planted, improvements to be made to buildings and equipment, strategies for economic advancement. This anticipatory planning served both practical purposes, allowing people to prepare mentally for upcoming work, and psychological purposes, providing hope and sense of purpose that countered winter's oppressive present. Spiritual and philosophical contemplation occupied many hours for religiously inclined individuals. The frontier's harsh realities raised profound questions about divine providence, human suffering, and the meaning of existence. Why did God allow innocent children to die? What purpose was served by the extreme hardship that frontier life demanded? How should one understand faith in the face of experiences that seem to contradict promises of divine care? Different people arrived at different answers to these questions. Some emerged from their contemplations with strengthened faith, having wrestled with doubts and found resolutions that satisfied them. Others experienced crises of faith, unable to reconcile their beliefs with their experiences. Still others developed more complex understandings that acknowledged ambiguity and uncertainty while maintaining connection to religious traditions. The role of memory in sustaining psychological health during winter's trials was crucial. People drew on memories of better times, recalling summer's abundance, autumn's beauty, previous spring's renewal. These memories provided evidence that current hardship was temporary, that life contained pleasures and comforts even if they weren't currently accessible. But memory could also be a source of pain, particularly for those who had left behind comfortable lives in more settled regions. Remembering warm, spacious homes with adequate food and fuel could make current privation seem even more unbearable by comparison. Recalling social networks of friends and extended family made current isolation feel more acute. Frontier families developed folklore and oral traditions that served partly to process and make meaning of their experiences. Stories of particularly difficult winters survived and were retold to subsequent generations, serving multiple functions. They preserved practical knowledge about survival strategies. They created heroic narratives that honored ancestors' endurance. They provided psychological preparation for people who would face their own winters, teaching them what to expect and how others had coped. These stories often emphasized themes of resilience, resourcefulness, and mutual aid. They celebrated individuals who had overcome seemingly impossible challenges through creativity and determination. They highlighted examples of neighbors helping each other survive through cooperation and generosity. Through these narratives, communities constructed shared identities rooted in collective experiences of hardship and triumph. The relationship between physical and psychological health during frontier winters was complex and bidirectional. Physical deprivation, inadequate nutrition, constant cold, and exhaustion from endless work clearly affected mental state. People who were hungry and cold had less psychological resilience and more difficulty maintaining positive attitudes than those who were adequately nourished and warm. Conversely, psychological state affected physical health in ways that frontier people recognized even without modern understanding of psychosomatic relationships. People who maintained hope and determination seemed to resist illness better than those who succumbed to despair. Individuals who found meaning and purpose in their struggles appeared to endure physical hardship more successfully than those who viewed their suffering as meaningless. This observation wasn't based on systematic scientific study, but on accumulated experience and intuition. Frontier families noticed that family members who gave up mentally often declined physically soon after, while those who maintained fighting spirit frequently recovered from illnesses or injuries that might have killed others. Whether this reflected actual cause and effect, or was simply observation bias, is difficult to determine, but the belief itself influenced behavior and possibly outcomes. The treatment of mental health problems during the frontier era was primitive by modern standards, reflecting limited understanding of psychological conditions and almost complete absence of professional mental health resources. Families coped with depression, anxiety, and more severe conditions like what we might now diagnose as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, using whatever resources they had available. Religious counseling from ministers, when accessible, provided one avenue of support for psychological distress. Ministers offered spiritual comfort, helped people find meaning in suffering, and sometimes provided practical advice about managing difficult emotions. The quality of this counsel varied enormously depending on the individual minister's wisdom, compassion, and experience. Community support, when available, helped families manage members experiencing psychological problems. Neighbours might provide respite care, taking children for periods to give struggling parents a break, or assisting with work when someone was too depressed to function adequately. This informal social support system, while imperfect, often made the difference between a family surviving intact or dissolving under the strain of mental illness. But some individuals with severe mental health problems received inadequate support and suffered terribly as a result. In the worst cases, people experiencing psychotic breaks or profound depression might be physically restrained to prevent them from harming themselves or others, confined in ways that undoubtedly worsened their condition. The lack of effective treatment options meant that some people endured years of suffering that modern medicine could have alleviated. The decision to migrate to the frontier in the first place had often involved psychological factors that weren't fully conscious or articulated. Some people were genuinely drawn to adventure and challenge, possessing temperaments that thrived on the intensity and meaning that frontier life provided. These individuals often adapted successfully to frontier conditions because their psychological needs aligned with what the frontier offered. Others had been fleeing problems in more settled regions, hoping that geographic relocation would solve difficulties that were actually internal or relational. These people frequently discovered that their problems had followed them west, and that frontier conditions actually exacerbated rather than resolved their underlying struggles. A man with alcohol problems found that isolation and stress made his drinking worse rather than better. A woman with depression discovered that loneliness intensified rather than relieved her condition. The question of whether frontier life selected for particular psychological characteristics is fascinating to consider. Did people with certain temperaments succeed disproportionately, while others failed or retreated back east? The evidence suggests that successful frontier adaptation required flexibility, tolerance for ambiguity, capacity for delayed gratification, and ability to find meaning in struggle. People who possessed these characteristics thrived relatively well. Those who lacked them often struggled profoundly. However, this wasn't entirely deterministic. Some people developed these characteristics through frontier experience itself, growing into capabilities they hadn't previously possessed. The frontier transformed them, forging psychological strengths through the crucible of hardship. Others failed to adapt despite years of trying, never developing the resilience and flexibility that successful frontier life required. The gender dynamics of psychological experience during frontier winters deserve particular attention. Men and women face different challenges and possess different resources for managing psychological stress, reflecting both biological differences and cultural expectations of the era. Women's psychological experience was complicated by the fact that most frontier women had not chosen migration as independently as men had. In the patriarchal culture of the era, husbands typically made decisions about where the family would live, and wives accompanied them whether they agreed with the choice or not. This meant that many women were enduring hardships they hadn't willingly chosen, creating resentment and anger that complicated their ability to cope. Additionally, women bore primary responsibility for childcare and household management, work that continued relentlessly regardless of their own physical or mental state. A woman experiencing depression still had to feed her children, maintain the fire, and perform countless other tasks. She couldn't take to her bed and withdraw from responsibility the way a man might do when overwhelmed. This necessity to continue functioning despite psychological distress sometimes helped by preventing complete collapse into helplessness, but it also meant women's mental health needs often went unaddressed. Men's psychological struggles took different forms, often centered on their roles as providers and protectors. A man who felt unable to adequately provide for his family during winter's scarcity might experience intense shame and guilt that he couldn't express openly without seeming to fail at masculinity. Cultural expectations that men be strong and stoic meant that many men suffered in silence rather than seeking support or acknowledging emotional vulnerability. The isolation of frontier life meant that men had few outlets for discussing their fears and struggles with other men. The masculine culture of the era frowned on emotional openness between men, expecting instead a facade of confidence and capability regardless of inner turmoil. This emotional isolation within isolation created particular vulnerability to depression and other mental health problems that might have been ameliorated through honest conversation and mutual support. The experience of children during frontier winters shaped their psychological development in ways that persisted throughout their lives. Children who successfully navigated frontier childhoods often emerged with exceptional resilience and competence, having learned through direct experience that they could endure hardship and contribute meaningfully to family survival. This early mastery of real challenges provided confidence and self-efficacy that served them well in adult life. However, frontier childhood also involved trauma that could leave lasting scars. Children who witnessed deaths of siblings or parents, who experienced near starvation or other severe deprivations, who were exposed to violence or frightening situations, often carried psychological wounds into adulthood. The frontier era lacked understanding of childhood trauma and its treatment, so these wounds typically went unaddressed and unhealed. The phenomenon of nostalgia for frontier experiences, common among aging pioneers in later life, reveals interesting psychological dynamics. Many people who had endured terrible hardships in their youth later remembered those times with fondness, emphasizing the positive aspects while minimizing or forgetting the suffering. This selective memory served psychological purposes, allowing people to construct meaningful narratives about their lives while maintaining positive self-concept. Some psychologists might interpret this nostalgia as a form of denial or distortion, but it might also represent healthy integration of difficult experiences into life narrative. By remembering hardship as something they overcame rather than something they merely suffered, pioneers maintained sense of agency and accomplishment that contributed to psychological well-being in old age. The transmission of trauma and resilience across generations is another fascinating dimension of frontier psychology. Children who grew up in frontier conditions carried both wounds and strengths into their adult lives and passed both to their own children. Some frontier families developed multi-generational patterns of psychological resilience, with each generation learning from the previous one's experiences and building on accumulated wisdom. Other families transmitted dysfunction and trauma, with patterns of depression, anxiety, or maladaptive coping strategies passing from parents to children. Without modern understanding of these dynamics or effective interventions to break destructive patterns, some families remained trapped in cycles of psychological struggle for generations. The role of animals in psychological well-being during frontier winters deserves mention. For families who kept livestock, the daily necessity of caring for animals provided structure and purpose that benefited mental health. Animals also offered emotional connection and companionship that partially compensated for human isolation. A man working alone in a barn might talk to his horses or cattle, maintaining his capacity for verbal interaction and finding comfort in their presence. Dogs, when families kept them, provided loyalty and affection that was particularly valuable during winter's isolation. A dog's unconditional positive regard offered emotional support without judgment or demand. For children especially, dogs could be confidants and playmates whose presence made confinement more bearable. The death of a beloved dog during winter could be genuinely devastating, a loss that seemed disproportionate to outsiders, but that reflected the animal's psychological importance to the family. The spiritual dimensions of psychological resilience during frontier winters connected closely to religious faith for most families. Belief that God had a purpose for their suffering, that their endurance had meaning in a larger divine plan, that they would be rewarded for their faithfulness. These convictions provided psychological resources that secular frameworks couldn't entirely replace. Prayer served multiple psychological functions beyond its spiritual purposes. It provided a method for processing difficult emotions, bringing fears and griefs before God, rather than holding them inside where they could fester. It offered a sense of agency in situations where people felt largely powerless, doing something in response to problems rather than passively accepting them. It created connection with the divine that partially compensated for isolation from human community. Religious rituals and observances provided structure and meaning that transcended immediate circumstances. Sabbath observance created weekly rhythms that differentiated time and provided regular rest. Religious holidays offered occasions for celebration even in the midst of hardship. Scripture reading and family devotions created shared experiences that bonded family members while connecting them to larger religious communities and traditions. However, religious faith could also create psychological burdens alongside its benefits. People who interpreted hardship as divine punishment for sin might experience guilt and shame that exacerbated rather than relieved their suffering. Those who believed they should accept suffering without complaint might suppress legitimate needs and feelings in ways that prevented healthy coping. The phenomenon of religious doubt during extreme hardship affected some believers profoundly. When prayers for relief went unanswered and suffering continued despite faithful devotion, some people experienced crises of faith that added spiritual anguish to physical hardship. The loss of religious certainty could feel like losing one's primary source of meaning and hope, leaving people psychologically adrift during their most vulnerable moments. Communities that formed around shared religious identity often provided more robust mutual support than those lacking such common ground. Religious communities understood themselves as bound together not merely by geographic proximity or economic interest, but by shared devotion to God and commitment to living according to religious principles. This deeper foundation for community created stronger obligations to assist members in need and more reliable networks of mutual aid. The question of whether frontier experience strengthened or weakened religious faith overall is difficult to answer definitively. Some people emerge from frontier trials with deepened faith, having experienced what they interpreted as divine providence and protection. Others lost faith entirely, unable to reconcile their experiences with belief in a loving and powerful God. Most probably experience fluctuations in faith, with periods of strong belief alternating with times of doubt and questioning. The psychological impact of witnessing death, particularly of children, during frontier winters cannot be overstated. In an era before modern medicine, childhood mortality was tragically common, with perhaps 1 in 4 children dying before age 5. Frontier conditions with their additional stresses and limited medical resources made childhood death even more frequent. Parents who lost children experienced grief complicated by guilt and self-doubt. Could they have done something differently that would have saved their child? Were they being punished for some sin or failing? How could they continue living after such devastating loss? These questions tormented bereaved parents, many of whom never fully recovered from their grief. The necessity to continue functioning after losing a child, to care for surviving children and maintain the household, meant that parents often couldn't give themselves adequate time to grieve. They had to suppress their emotions and continue with daily tasks, bottling up pain that might have been healthier to express. This delayed or incomplete grief processing could lead to long-term psychological problems including depression and complicated grief disorders. Siblings who lost brothers or sisters experienced their own forms of traumatic grief, complicated by their developmental stage and the family's emotional resources for supporting them. Young children might not fully understand death's permanence, experiencing confusion and anxiety as they tried to make sense of a sibling's disappearance. Older children understood death intellectually, but struggled to process it emotionally, often receiving inadequate support from parents who were themselves overwhelmed with grief. The cultural practices around death and mourning during the frontier era provided some structure for grief, but also imposed limitations that could be problematic. Mourning rituals, when they could be observed despite frontier isolation, gave people sanctioned ways to express grief and to mark the significance of loss. Wearing mourning clothing, observing periods of reduced social activity, visiting grave sites, these practices all served psychological purposes in helping people process grief. However, cultural expectations could also constrain healthy grieving. Men were expected to be stoic and strong, showing little emotion even after devastating losses. Women were permitted more emotional expression, but were also expected to subordinate their grief to the needs of surviving family members. Children's grief was often minimized or dismissed, with adults assuming that children would simply get over losses without needing special support. The physical conditions of burial during winter, when ground was frozen solid and proper burial often impossible, complicated grief in practical ways. Keeping a body in an outbuilding until spring thaw allowed. Burial meant that the death remained a constant physical presence that prevented emotional closure. Makeshift temporary burials followed by proper interment months later meant experiencing the loss repeatedly rather than achieving final goodbye. The markers placed on frontier graves, often simple wooden crosses or stones, reflected both economic constraints and the desire to memorialize the dead in some permanent way. These markers served psychological purposes for survivors, providing physical locations where they could visit and remember their loved ones, tangible evidence that the dead had existed and mattered. The deterioration of wooden markers over time created additional grief as physical evidence of loved ones gradually disappeared. The psychological impact of surviving when others died created its own complex emotional aftermath. People who had lost family members while themselves surviving sometimes experienced guilt, questioning why they had been spared while others had died. This survivor's guilt could be particularly intense for parents who had outlived their children, feeling that the natural order had been reversed and that they should have been the ones to die. The meaning-making process after loss, the attempt to understand why death had occurred and what it signified, varied enormously by individual and cultural context. Religious frameworks provided ready-made explanations: God's will, divine providence, eventual reunion in heaven, that some people found genuinely comforting. Others found these explanations inadequate or even offensive, unable to accept that a loving God would allow such suffering. Secular meaning-making focused more on natural causes and random chance, understanding deaths as tragic but not personally meaningful events. This framework avoided the theological struggles of trying to reconcile death with divine benevolence, but it could also feel empty and cold, providing no larger purpose or consolation for suffering that seemed senseless and cruel. The long-term psychological legacy of frontier winter survival, both for individuals who experienced it and for subsequent generations, shaped American culture in ways that persist even today. The values of self-reliance, practical competence, and stoic endurance that frontier life demanded became cultural touchstones that influenced how Americans understood themselves and their national character. The frontier experience created a particular kind of psychological toughness, an ability to endure hardship without complaint and to maintain function despite adversity. This toughness served adaptive purposes during frontier conditions, but it could also create problems in other contexts. The same stoicism that enabled survival during winter's trials could prevent healthy emotional expression in situations where vulnerability and openness would be more appropriate. The emphasis on practical competence and self-sufficiency that frontier life required sometimes came at the expense of other valuable human qualities. The ability to can vegetables and build shelters was indeed important, but so were capacities for emotional intimacy, artistic expression, intellectual curiosity, and playful joy. The frontier's demands didn't always leave space for developing these other dimensions of human potential. The community bonds forged through shared frontier hardship created social capital that benefited participants and their communities for generations. People who had helped each other survive winter's trials maintained those connections throughout their lives, creating networks of mutual support that transcended individual family boundaries. These networks facilitated economic cooperation, provided social support during later crises, and transmitted values of mutual aid to subsequent generations. However, frontier communities could also be insular and suspicious of outsiders, having learned through experience that survival often depended on maintaining strong boundaries between those who could be trusted and those who could not. This wariness served protective purposes during vulnerable frontier periods, but could persist as xenophobia or prejudice that caused problems as communities matured and diversified. As you rest now, contemplating these psychological dimensions of frontier winter survival, perhaps you recognize resonances with your own experiences of hardship and endurance. The specific circumstances of your challenges differ vastly from those faced by frontier families, but the fundamental psychological dynamics remain surprisingly similar. We all face periods when external circumstances test our psychological resources to their limits. We all discover through adversity aspects of ourselves, both strengths and vulnerabilities, that remain hidden during comfortable times. We all depend on relationships with others to sustain us through trials that would overwhelm us if faced alone. We all need meaning and purpose to endure suffering that would otherwise seem unbearable. The frontier families who survived winter's psychological challenges alongside its physical demands teach us that human beings possess remarkable capacities for resilience and adaptation. They also teach us humility about our limitations, acknowledging that some challenges overwhelm even the strongest individuals, that survival sometimes depends on luck as much as virtue, that endurance doesn't always lead to triumph. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that the psychological resources that enabled frontier survival, the flexibility to adapt to harsh realities, the determination to persist despite overwhelming odds, the capacity to find meaning in struggle, live within you as part of your human inheritance. When your own psychological winter arrives, you will discover that you too possess strengths you never knew you had, that you too can endure what seems impossible, that you too will eventually find spring's renewal after winter's trial,